Hello, and welcome back to another whiskey and science talk. This time about nosing and tasting. I want to touch on a delicate subject, and that's the objectivity of nosing and tasting. Now, as a whiskey taster or a whiskey enthusiast, we all share the same social context. We tend to use the same vocabulary to describe whiskey. There's a certain consensus on which terms to use. Instead of have all the words and the language available to us, we use a small amount of socially constituted terms. A good example of this would be the taste wheel from Whisky magazine. I don't know if you can see it, but basically it separates different flavor profiles into even more specific flavors and so on and so on. For example, fruity note could be separated even further into fresh fruit, cooked fruit, dry fruit, and so on and so on. And you could go out this funnel and be even more specific. We can talk about oranges, we can talk about kiwi, we can talk about lemon, we can talk about marmalade, jam, barley sugar, mixed peel fruit cakes, and so on and so on and so on. The same with the floral note. It could be leafy, it could be hay-like, even more specific. It could be green leaves, it could be green sticks, pea pawns, and so on and so on. These are all more or less socially constituted and socially accepted terms within whiskey tasting, and it actually helps us in describing a whiskey to another person who actually knows a little bit about whiskey. But I've been on the internet and I found a review from a very well-respected whiskey reviewer. I actually found two reviews of the same whiskey, same batch, and so on and so on and so on. But let me read it to you. The first one. The nose offers up a herbal cherry cough drop. Sour cherry, slightly sour is raisin, hints of mint, a light dash of vanilla, and gentle oak on the trail. That's fine, no problem there. The palate starts on plums, dusted with powdered sugar, then turns a bit tangery, some oak on the finish. Water adds a dusting of powdered sugar on the nose and more on the palate than it already had. The tangy notes are largely gone. Summary: fruit, herbal and oaky notes, perhaps a bit too sourish. Okay, let me read the next tasting notes for you from another reviewer, but on the same whiskey, same batch. Nose, initially leafy with a slight farmy maltiness. The malt soon fades as a hint of licorice root joins the leafiness. Eventually a slight citrus vanilla appears, maybe even pineapple. Okay. Palate, there's something definite pineapple on the palate, alongside licorice root and well wrapped in autumn leaves. I also detect a suggestion of creamy vanilla. Finish, medium and slightly dry right at the end. Yep, that's all very well. Even though that we share this social context with a fairly limited vocabulary. Let's say we have about 50, 60 or maybe even 70 accepted terms for describing the taste and the smell of a whiskey. Only one descriptor, only one is alike in these two reviews, or not reviews. Why do I call them reviews all the time? Tasting notes. The only thing that they can agree on is vanilla. and vanilla is kind of a fallback descriptor because it's almost always present. So I'm not gonna make any conclusions because I've seen this 1,000 times. This was actually the first two tasting notes that came up when I did my Google search, and it's I haven't been hunting for reviews that contradict each other. Almost all reviews out there contradict each other to such an extreme degree that it's so hard to see any objectivity coming from reading a review or some reviews like this. So is there any way that we can bring some objectivity back into nosing and tasting a whiskey? Let me take you to my computer by the magic of editing. Welcome to my computer. I just realized that I actually wasn't finished making my point. I have a lot more to say, so while I'm gonna babble on about whiskey, then you can look at this video. At least something is going on the screen. So if you can bear with me just for 4 minutes or something like that, I'll try to explain myself a little better. I'm gonna rely on some notes that I have in front of me because I have a lot to say. But from my point of view, one of the problems with tasting notes is that even though we share a certain social context as a whiskey enthusiast, and thereby a specific vocabulary for describing whiskey, we do not share the same point of reference in contrast to tasting notes themselves. As an example, let's say that a certain whiskey contains a specific aldehyde found in hay. Some may describe this as smelling as dry morning hay, some as green grass, and some as leaves, and some may say bitterness, and some may not pick it up at all due to the quantity of the aldehyde, or some other variable in the environment. Personally, I haven't done any studies on the subject of people describing the same chemical compound differently due to social factors. But I base this assumption on the reasoning that somebody who have never smelled dry morning hay is very unlikely to describe it as dry morning hay, but is very much more likely to use a descriptor from his or her own frame of reference, aka his or her social world. As human beings, our reference point, in contrast to these specific chemical compound found in whiskey or other products in general, is very much a result of our upbringing and our genetic disposition. In regard to the genetic disposition, a study published in Science Daily and made by, as far as I can tell, very legit authors connected to real universities has shown that beta ion, I think that's the way it's pronounced, or something like that, beta ion, the smell associated with violets is perceived differently by different people. The sensitivity to that particular compound and to perceive it as a floral note varies, and people who are less good at smelling this compound also describe the smell differently, as sour or sharp, and are generally less likely to find it pleasant. The article also describes other different compounds and are linking them to specific genetic differences. But the point being, in this vlog at least, is that both our generic makeup and the social world that surround us makes it hard to justify our own or other people's interpretation of the smell and taste of whiskey as an objective reference to what the whiskey actually smells or tastes like, because the whiskey will taste or at least smell differently to different people. But with the above, let's call it an assumption. I think that it would be reasonable to assume that one were to find extreme variations when reading through tasting notes from different people from different parts of the country or the world in general. And that's very much the case, as I've shown before, with the comparison of the two different tasting notes. But I also think it would be reasonable to assume that people who not only share the same context in regard to whiskey, but the same social context in general, and maybe even the same genetic structure, aka family tree, would have a tendency to describe these flavors in a more uniform way. But this is just an assumption. I haven't seen any empirical evidence on the matter. I'm just speculating. So anyway, is there any way to overcome this genetic and social cultural mountain of subjectivity and bring some order to the chaos? As I stated in the other video, when describing whiskey, when being scientific about anything, the key is to eliminate variables. So how does one eliminate variables in the context of tasting and nosing whiskey? Well, for once, we can use the same type of glassware. We can use the same settings or settings alike. And by settings, I mean something like being in a room with approximately the same temperature with no excessive smells or noises to distract you, and so on and so on. We can eliminate some of these real world physical variables when we are tasting and nosing. But of course we can't change our genetic structure or cultural background. We simply have to live with the possibility that the genetics is playing a role in nosing and tasting. In terms of culture, one can compensate for some of these variables by joining the whiskey culture and learning the ways of tasting and nosing by the elderly in that particular culture. Though I would argue that there also is another way of reducing the impact of both the cultural and genetic differences. As I said before, the cultural fellowship of the whiskey community helps you communicate by the means of the connoisseur's vocabulary, and thereby reducing the uncertainty in tasting and nosing. But as shown, there's still a lot of uncertainty. But what if we were to reduce that vocabulary even further? Let me show you this whiskey wheel from the Whisky magazine. I think it is from the Whisky magazine. Yes. Let's take a look at this whiskey wheel. It's a perfect example of the vocabulary available to us within the culture of whiskey tasting. But it's very much not a neutral descriptor. It's very much cultural coded. If we're gonna look at the woody note, let's see here. There's a descriptor like rice pudding, burnt toast, custard, cream, caramel, toffee. I bet you that these descriptors were made not by an Indian but by an Englishman or a Scotsman. If we're gonna look at the even more generic descriptor, like new wood, old wood, or vanilla, these would still require you to know what new wood, old wood, and vanilla smells like. But what if we were to make some descriptors that were even more generic than these ones? We could make a basic flavor profile that only relies on the basic flavor receptors of the human being, aka sweet, sour, bitter, and salty. Then we will only have to rely on the person's ability to judge sweet, bitter, sour, and salty within the context of whiskey. Let me show you this diagram I've made. I taking the whiskey black label and Colilla as an example, and I'm gonna judge them on a scale from 1 to 10. on how sweet, sour, salty, and bitter and smoky they are. Kolila, I'm gonna give it a 5. It's medium sweet, a little bit sour, salty, a little bit bitter, no, and fairly smoky. It's not a Lefroy, but it's still pretty smoky. Black Label, very sweet, but I could imagine a whiskey being sweeter. Sour, a little bit salty, nah. Bitter, nah. And fairly smoky due to the sorry, not fairly smoky, a little bit smoky due to the Kolila and Talisker added. The problem is, of course, that you lose all the complexity when using a more generic descriptor. But a more generic descriptor like sweet will inevitably be more accurate, since it incorporates more flavor compounds and only rely on the basic flavor receptors of the human being. But yeah, of course, it fails to embrace the complexity of whiskey. I don't think there's any perfect solution to the problem of subjectivity. I think a diagram like this, or a reductionist approach in general, helps with the reduction of uncertainty. But on the other hand, it lacks the explaining power of the more complex or the ordinary approach to whiskey tasting. But I do, however, think that it would be reasonable to assume that by joining the whiskey culture and practicing tasting and nosing and keeping a fairly constant environment when tasting and nosing, this approach will in general produce more constant and accurate results. Well, I think that's it. And remember, much of what I've said in this video is only based on assumption and not empirical evidence as such. But in the next video, let's throw another variable into the mix and make an even more confusing video. And let's see what happens when we add water to whiskey. Thank you for your patience and have a very nice day. Bye bye.